In this section, we're going to continue our layout here, and we're going to take care of the material sheet, which is really interesting in iOS. This is something that you can find in the iOS UI kit, where we have different presets. This is not like in Figma, where you're setting a custom blur strength and custom vibrancy using blending mode. In this case, it has presets such as the thickness of the material sheet and also the content that goes on top, such as the text using a secondary color or tertiary color, is going to have its own vibrancy. So depending on the thickness of the sheet, it's going to be more or less strong to give a better contrast. So all of this is done automatically for you, and you don't have to customize those numbers. So back to Xcode, we are going to disable the inspector. At this point, we're going to focus on the code, and we're going to start to write new elements and modifiers without relying on the insert tool and the inspector. Now let's go to the container, and that is the VStack. If you want to go to the end of it, you can double click on the curly brace and it's going to automatically show you where it ends. And so these are the modifiers that are applying to the container. Now for the background, right now we have a green gradient. And for using the material sheet, all we need to do is to replace that. So dot, and then we have the option for the auto completion. As always, you should always use the auto completion as much as you can. It's going to help you a lot as a beginner to not make mistakes and not use the wrong properties. So in this case, we're going to use regular material. This is the main one, and if you want to change it, you can type material, and it can serve as a way to search or at least to filter down to the main material options, including the ultra thin to the ultra thick. So you can see that these are the different options that you can use, and we can pick the ultra thin one, and this is going to show more of the colors in the background versus thick. It's going to show more if it was a flat color with better contrast. Now, as you can see here, it's very difficult to see the different thickness of the material, and that's because it works best when you have a background. So we're going to add one in the back. So this is going to be more of a three-dimensional layer. So we're going to use the Z axis. So we have X and then Y, but if you do it in a three-dimensional way, then there's going to be the third axis. Now this is a very important concept for the Mac as well, because typically it has a background, and also for the new Vision OS, which is going to use a lot of the material sheet in front of the background in a three-dimensional space. Now before we continue, we're going to switch to the play mode, and this is the default mode. You want to stay in this mode most of the time unless you want to inspect some of these elements, but otherwise definitely use the live mode most of the time. Now let's scroll to the very top, and we want to put the VStack above a background. So we're going to right click on the VStack, embed in a ZStack. So again, HStack is horizontal and vertical stack for the VStack, and then ZStack, this is where we have one layer in front of another one. So right before the VStack, we're going to write image, parentheses, then select the first option, which is resource. Now, one thing that is new in Xcode 15 is that you have all your images that is set up as a list in your auto-completion. So you can just press dot, and here you have all your images in this list, which is really useful so that you can avoid having mistakes in your double quotes, for example, and that happens a lot. But now you don't have that problem anymore. So you can just select, for example, image 1, and this is referencing the image 1 in your assets catalog. As you can see here, it does not have exactly the same name, and it does the camel case automatically, so you don't have the capital I. So you don't have to worry about the typo in your name for your assets. Now for images, it tends to take the original size. So in this case, we exported at 3x, and that's why it's really big. So what you want to do is to scale it down to fit the screen. So we're going to add a modifier called resizable. And this is going to simply resize your image to fit the size of the screen minus the save areas. So that includes the home indicator as well as the notch. Now, as you can see, it doesn't respect the aspect ratio. So you're going to need to have another modifier for aspect ratio, and you can set to fill or fit. This is going to ensure that the image is not stretched, and we're going to add a frame, and in the frame we're going to set a property for height to 300. Then we're going to set a corner radius, so corner radius, and set it to 20. Now, as you can see, we have a much more interesting material sheet when we have a background. It's taking the vibrancy of the colors, and also the secondary color for the text is showing something that is a lot more vibrant versus a flat color that is the main icon. So this is the difference between vibrant text versus a flat color. In fact, if you want to go to that image, which is the icon, we can change the tint to secondary, and it's going to use that vibrancy again, ensuring that we have good contrast. And of course, it's going to respect the material sheet based on ultra thin or ultra thick. It's going to have more of that flat color or less of that background, or if you want something in the middle, that would be regular material. Let me fix the indentation here, and then we're going to add the icons at the bottom. So since we don't need the top icon, we're going to simply move that. So just cut the whole thing and put that after the H tag. So double click here, and after the modifiers, add a bit of space, and then paste that icon. Now we're going to use Control I to auto indent. Then we can remove the modifiers because we don't need that vibrancy. And so now I'm going to embed in H tag and add 2 more icons. So Command D 2 times. Let me set the 3 icons. So ellipse, then sparkle dot magnifying glass, then face dot smiling. I'm also going to add a divider between each. So now it's going to push the content, which means that I'm going to need a frame using a height of 44. But before the frame, I'm going to add a little bit of padding so that my line is a little bit shorter, but also it's a better practice if I want to add a background, for example, or an outline later on. Okay, so now let's add another icon to the far right. But first we're going to set embed in H tag and fix the indentation. Then I'm going to add an image. Instead of using resource, I'm going to set parentheses, system name, then double quotes, and the name of the icon reference from the SF symbols list. So it's square and a row down, and notice that it's just adding without space and without really pushing the content. Now in Figma or in CSS, you would select the container and you would set something like flex space between. But in Swift UI, you just need to set a spacer. So the spacer is going to push the content, because just like a divider or a color or a rectangle, it's going to take the maximum space, except that it doesn't have any visual attached to it. So it's simply going to push things and take all available space. So I'm going to try to be consistent with the size of the icons and where a background would be. So for example, if I set a background, you're going to see that it looks a little bit like this. But if I set a background here, it's going to just show it this way. Typically, you want to have that padding to be able to click and have that extra space, so that if you have a background or an outline or a tappable area, so this is much friendlier. Now I'm just going to remove the background because I don't need it. It was just to show a demo. So I'm going to copy the padding and the frame and apply that to the image as well. It's going to create that consistent padding. Now, the next thing I want to do is to make sure that this stack of icons will be hugging the bottom left. So there are two ways to go about this. Of course, you can decide to remove the padding, and then you would have to add the padding for the text and for this stack. But another way is to use offset. So this allows you to move things in the X and Y axis from its original position. So for example, I'm going to set this for the H tag using offset modifier, X and Y. So X, I'm going to set to -20 to offset the padding, and Y to 20. Then I'll do the same for the image. So offset X 20 and then Y 20. Awesome. So let's finish by adding a bit of padding to the container. So right after corner radius, we're going to set a padding of 20. Then for the Z stack, which is the next curly braces, you can double click on it to make sure that it's referencing the Z stack. I'm going to add a padding of 20 as well. Now I can offset the floating material container to move down a little bit, just like in the design. So for that, we're going to use offset Y80. So let's take a look at the preview options, because here we have a number of options, including the device settings. So we can switch between light and dark mode. And it looks really nice because so far we're not using any custom color. We're using the adaptive ones such as primary and secondary. And then we can play with the portrait and landscape mode. And now we're noticing that the card is a little bit too wide. So in design, typically you want to have a max width for your card, otherwise the text is just going to go very, very wide, especially for the iPad and for desktop. So you want to set a maximum for that. And to do that, we're going to set right after padding a frame, and instead of using width or height, you're going to set max width 400. So now it looks great regardless of the orientation. Now here, the frame should be before the padding, because otherwise the actual size is 360. In fact, you can measure that pretty quickly by first going to the maximum size in orientation landscape. But here notice that we have a zooming, and if you want to go 1-to-1, you can set zoom to 100%, and you can do Command Shift 4, which is kind of like a quick tool for screenshot, but also a lot of designers use that for measuring. So you can see here, it's roughly 360. And so we're going to put the frame before the padding. And now it should be 400. Next, we can take a look at the dynamic type. And here you can see how your UI is going to look like depending on the size. So typically what you want to do is, for most layouts, you don't want to have a maximum or fixed height depending on the size of the text, or the other solution is to have a maximum size text for certain cards especially. Notice that the UI starts to break at XXX large. So what we can do is to limit the range between extra small to XX large. Let's add a new modifier called dynamic type size. And here we're going to set .xsmall triple dot to .xx large. Great. So you can see here, if I test and it tries to go above that, it's going to have a maximum, and it still works with small and xsmall. Now, if you want to test all of that, you can use variants, which is going to show you all of them next to each other. So in this case, I'm just going to set it back to portrait, and it's going to have both color schemes next to each other. And you can definitely test this simultaneously with dynamic type, but otherwise you can go to variants and go to orientation as well, and also dynamic type variants. So it's going to test all of them at the same time. Now each of these screens can be maximized, and as you can see, some of this content is not fitting correctly. So what you can do is go to the next one, and this is the maximum, which is XX large, and you can set the maximum to really make it work, or you can also change the padding based on what you think is going to be best for your content. So for example, I can set it to 8. Cool. So that's how you use the variants and the preview options to really test your layout against different schemes and orientation and dynamic type. It's really useful. If you want to go back, just click on the play icon, and now you're at the default view. Now in the next section, we're going to cover the outline style using a gradient, and also we're going to try to create these custom rounded corners. So I'll see you in the next section.